Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of The Voice of the Paper. My name is Ryan Walter, and I'm joined today by
Maggie Moore, digital media editor of The Flat Hat.
We will be your hosts today as we walk you through the Flat Hat stories that you can find in the paper this week, but also find a little more detail here on The Voice of the Paper. Maggie, why don't you begin with the first story of the day?
Yeah, so the headline this week is that there was a climate strike last Friday. It was part of a global strike for action. Millions of people protested around the world last week, calling for more action against climate change more rapidly because that's necessary to prevent catastrophic warming.
Absolutely.
So there were a lot of people with signs, a lot of community members, professors, students, and a bunch of different organizations joined. Andaki Tribe was there, Young Democratic Socialists, and the American Indian Student Association, and they were all calling for structural change, and it drew an estimated crowd of about 450 people, which is pretty good. Last year they had a similar event, but only 40 students attended, so it's good to see more people caring.
Absolutely, yeah, and those really played in with the global climate strikes that were going on through this country and, throughout the world, starting with the Pacific Island nations early in the morning. Why don't we go on to our next story, which is Dean of Students Office removes anonymity, excuse me for my pronunciation, option in care reports.
Yeah, so as of April of this year, students can't submit anonymous care reports. This doesn't mean that the person who you are care reporting on will see, but it does mean that the administration needs your name attached to the care report that you're submitting. Apparently, the anonymous option was actually only instated 2 years ago, so this was just a return to the previous state. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they did that is because there was an overwhelming number of incomplete anonymous care reports, which means that they weren't really useful in any way.
Right.
So in order to act on those reports, the administration is now requiring that you add your name just so that they know someone involved in case something happens, I suppose. And it was determined that the level of risk associated with accepting anonymous reports was worse than adding a name back into it.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us to our third story. We're going to flip the page here real quick, which is about more page flipping.
So in reaction to the climate strikes this past week, we have two staff opinion pieces on wildly different ends of the scale. The first is by Gavin Akeen. He's one of our sports editors. He really likes writing opinions pieces, and his argument is that the climate strike was basically useless because there were other things that people could have done to demonstrate their support for helping the environment. They could have contacted senators and congressmen or done more sustainable things in their own lives, and that being able to skip class at your elite college shows a level of privilege. There were some very strongly worded points in there. Mm-hmm. And then the other piece is from Ethan Brown. He's our managing editor, and he argues against Gavin, saying that he's heard both sides of the argument, but that it's ultimately very helpful for students to show that they care and get other people involved, and that it's more important to take action than to tear down people who are demonstrating and raising more awareness for issues. And to be fair, we live streamed the climate strike, and I was there, and they did mention several other actions that people could take if they cared about the environment. So
absolutely, and it's great for the Flat Hat to show both sides of that argument there and give people voices by which they can be read. We're going to move now to our coverage of the Hispanic Heritage Month events that went on last week.
Yeah, so the Latin American Student Union has been holding a number of tabling events and other things to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, and one of those was an open discussion called The Different Faces of Latinidad, an Afro-Latino discussion. And the president said that he thinks it's especially important to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month right now with the specific U.S. administration in office right now. The Latina community has been a target of a lot of attacks. And right now, LASU is in its 10th year as an organization, and they do a lot of good activities like this. Things discussed at that talk were race, ethnicity, discrimination, racism, nationalism, and privilege. So a good thing to hold a discussion about.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can find coverage of that and the other stories we've mentioned in the Flat Hat, as well as our coverage of sports, which unfortunately did not look too great for the Tribe this past week. We're going to talk real quick about our women's soccer team, which unfortunately lost 1-0 to the Princeton Tigers, despite their best efforts. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Voice of the Paper. You can find all of these stories and more in the print version of the Flat Hat, which you can find around campus. My name is Ryan Walter.
I'm Maggie Moore.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.